Hello, and welcome to Trek Tuesday here on KRAD COVID Readings. Welcome to February, and as with last month and the next 8 months, I will be reading from my Starfleet Corps of Engineers series. I say my because I actually did help create it, and I wrote several pieces for the series. The series ran from 2000 to 2007. The books were originally released as ebooks. This was back before ebooks became the hottest thing since sliced toast. Simon & Schuster was very much ahead of the curve there. And we did a monthly series of ebooks. We started the launch in 2000 with 3 ebooks, one of which I read last month, Fatal Error, that I wrote, as well as one by Dean Wesley Smith and Christy Golden. There was then a 2-parter written by Dayton Ward and Kevin Dillmore called Interphase, which came out, I believe, at the beginning of 2001. I don't remember the exact pub date on those yet. Off the top of my head, it was 20 years ago. But and then we launched aggressively as a monthly series, starting with the one I'm going to read right now, which is Cold Fusion. Cold Fusion came out in, I want to say July 2001, thereabouts, and actually came about as a crossover. Because in addition to launching the Starfleet Corps of Engineers monthly series in 2001, that year also saw the launch of the post-finale Deep Space Nine novels. For the first time in Simon & Schuster's long publishing history with Star Trek, the powers that be at Paramount Pictures / CBS / whatever corporate entity owned it, gave them permission to continue one of the series after its conclusion. The original series and The Next Generation both, continued to do movies after the series, and there wasn't really an end point. They were still, in essence, ongoing. I mean, yes, technically the original series had an end point, but that was with Star Trek VI. But there was never really a sense of doing stories after the finale with the original series. And The Next Generation was still going on with movies. With Deep Space Nine, once it went off the air in 1999, there were no plans for any future anything with DS9 on screen. So the novels were given permission to continue the story after What You Leave Behind. This is the first time they had done that. And it kind of broke the dam. After Nemesis was released, Next Generation stories continued after that. After Endgame, post-finale Voyager novels happened, and then after These Are the Voyages, post-finale Enterprise novels happened. All of the things to do that, but Deep Space Nine was the first. And it started with a 2-book series called Avatar by S.D. Perry, in which, among other things, Deep Space Nine, the station, had to eject its fusion core. And so they were basically without power. In the next book, which was a novel called Abyss, which was also part of a crossover called Section 31, in Abyss by David Weddle and Jeffrey Lang, it opened with Nog, who, if you will recall from the end of DS9, was made the new chief of operations of the station, was leading a convoy that towed Empok Nor, which was DS9's sister station, into the Bajoran system, basically to be available for spare parts. I was tasked by both John Ordover, who was the supervising editor on the Corps of Engineers series. He was the in-house editor. I was freelance editing it. And Marco Palmieri, who was the editor of the Deep Space Nine novels, with doing a story that basically bridged that gap, that told the story of how Nog got Empok Nor there, with the help of the Da Vinci crew. So that's what we did. Just to fill in the gap a little bit, since Fatal Error, you'll recall from last week that 110 wasn't sure what to do with himself. What he actually decided to do was stay alone, not return to Binus and find another mate, but instead to go it alone. He changed his name because he was no longer considered worthy by Binus to have a numerical designation, so he now goes by the name Soloman. And he's pretty much an outcast from Pinar society at this point. So he enlists in Starfleet and is now in uniform as an enlisted specialist, as a computer specialist on the Da Vinci. And think that covers all the background you need, so let's just kick right in with part 1 of Cold Fusion. Chapter 1. Commander, I humbly request permission to feed Abramowitz to the larvae. Kieran Duffy sighed, rolled his eyes, took a sip of his coffee, then looked up at the Nassat standing before him in the mess hall. What is it this time, Patty? P8 Blue, presently standing upright on her 2 rear legs, was tossing a pad back and forth among 4 of her arms. Oh, it's nothing different. She simply will not stop playing that music. Have you asked her to stop? Repeatedly. Endlessly. Continuously. Well, at least your grasp of adverbs is improving. Commander, holding up a hand, Duffy said, look, I'll talk to her, okay? I have to be on the bridge in 5, and that's the other thing. We're always on and off duty at the same time. I cannot avoid her. I would like to renew my request for a new roommate. I've asked around, but of course nobody wants to room with her, Patty said. Her voice raised several octaves, a range Duffy hadn't known her to be capable of, and she was now tossing the pad around so fast it was blurry. Nobody can stand that music of hers! Sonny, come home, was all Duffy could think, especially since this was mostly her fault. Well, kind of. In addition to her duties as commanding officer of the Starfleet Corps of Engineers team on the U.S.S. DaVinci, Commander Sonia Gomez was also the DaVinci's first officer, and was therefore responsible for making up the duty assignments. Of course, the last time she'd done so was before Carol Abramowitz, the S.C.E's team's cultural specialist, got her hands on a new recording of Sinravian Drad music, specifically the newest from Blee Lu, the founder of Drad's atonal minimalist subgenre. Unfortunately, Gomez was presently on a special assignment to the planet Sarandar, helping the Nalori Republic to get a subspace accelerator working. This left Duffy, normally the ship's second officer, pulling double duty as the ship's XO, which meant that personnel issues like this, that he had been more than happy to dump on Sonny's lap, were now his problem. In all his years in Starfleet, Kieran Duffy had heard many different types of music, and many more reactions to same. He'd heard Klingon opera that could put a spring in one's step and stop others dead in their tracks from the headache. He'd once seen a Vulcan ambassador moved to tears by the same Mozart piece that, years later, moved a Tellarite engineer to throw up. But pretty much everyone who wasn't from Sinrav, and many who were, found Lou's music to be completely unlistenable, except for Carol Abramowitz. Gulping down the last of his coffee, Duffy got up. After swallowing, he said, Patty, I'm really not sure what I can do except maybe change the duty roster, he thought suddenly. You're the first officer until Sonny comes back. You can do that. Except maybe change the duty roster, he said after his moment of clarity. I'll fix it so that you're on gamma shift when Carol's off, okay? Now holding the pad in only one hand, Patty made a tinkling noise. Most non-Nassats couldn't distinguish one such noise from another, but Duffy had been serving with Patty long enough to be able to do so. This one, high-pitched with the higher notes about a second and a half apart, was the equivalent of a sigh of relief. Thank you, sir. You're welcome. And no feeding her to the larvae. Duffy hesitated. Do your larvae really eat people? Another tinkling noise, this one lower-pitched. A shrug. Only when they can get them. They'll eat anything. Well, I must take this report to Lieutenant Barnack. Thank you again, sir. With that, Patty got down on all eights and skittered out of the mess hall. Duffy wondered how much of Carol's insistence on playing Lou's music was personal preference, and how much was a defense mechanism triggered by living with an insect. 2 security guards, Drew and Hawkins, were sitting at one of the far tables. Hawkins said, I think she was kidding, sir, about the larvae. Oh, definitely, Drew said. They're actually very picky eaters. Sighing and shaking his head, Duffy left the mess hall, wondering if Sonny had ever had to put up with this. Chapter 2. David Gold had been listening to the latest letter from his granddaughter Ruth for the 15th time when the message from the bridge came in. Message from Deep Space Nine, sir, said Lieutenant McAllen's voice. Gold frowned. They were en route to DS9 already. On screen. Ruth's pretty glowing face was replaced on the view screen in Gold's quarters by the Starfleet logo, and then by the image of a woman wearing the uniform of a Bajoran militia colonel. Though he had never met her, Gold instantly recognized her as DS9's commanding officer, Kira Nerys. Colonel Kira, he said. This is Captain Gold. Is everything all right? Hello, Captain. Yes, everything's fine. Don't worry. This is a simple diversion call. So the last dispatch we got was accurate. Those Jem'Hadar who attacked the station were renegades? For some time, the whole quadrant was on yellow alert, and many were convinced that the Dominion War, over for less than 4 months, was going to start right back up again. Gold was worried that this call was going to be bad news. Unexpected calls from high-ranking officers almost always were. Yes, the dispatch was accurate. Unfortunately, part of the process of stopping them involved ejecting our fusion core. Oi! Kira looked almost amused. Oi pretty much sums it up, Captain. We still need your help putting the station back together, just not here at the station. You're to rendezvous with one of our runabouts, the Rio Grande, in the Trevis system. We're forwarding the exact coordinates to you now. You'll meet up with Lieutenant Nog, our Chief Operations Officer. Gold recalled that the Trevis system was an unclaimed space near the Cardassian border. And this is going to help the station? Let's hope so. We need to get this place operational before we run out of emergency power. The Lieutenant will have all the details. Whatever you say, Colonel. We're happy to be of service, however you need us. At that, Kira actually smiled, though it didn't extend to her entire face. This is a woman under a lot of pressure, Gold thought, being all too familiar with that look from his own years in the center seat. Actually, Captain, the S.C.E. has already been a great help to us, and honestly, if you could accompany the Rio Grande back to DS9, we could probably use more of that service. That should be doable, Colonel. I've heard a lot of good things about your station. In fact, one of my engineers used to serve there. It'll be a privilege to visit, and to help out. The privilege will be all ours, Captain, and I wouldn't worry about the mission either. Nog's a pro. I'm sure it'll all go completely smoothly. Chapter 3. Fabian Stevens stared at the sleeping form of Domenica Corsi in the bed with him, wondering how exactly this had happened. He had gone into the mess hall when he had come off shift the night before, figuring to do a little reading over a synthale before going to bed. To his surprise, Lieutenant Commander Corsi had been there. It was the first time Stevens could ever remember seeing the Da Vinci Chief of Security in the mess hall. She generally preferred to eat in her quarters. Even more surprising was her request for him to join her. He'd conversed with her while off duty about as often as he'd seen her in the mess hall, and yet here she was, inviting him over. Intrigued by the novelty, as much as anything, he had agreed. Senior staff and S.C.E. team report to the observation lounge immediately. It was Lieutenant McAllen's voice, and the beep that had preceded it had an immediate effect. In repose, Corsi's features were unusually soft, like a porcelain doll sitting under lights in a glass case. The effect was magnified by her blonde hair, normally tied severely back, cascading loosely about the pillow. As soon as the beep sounded, though, the hard edges returned, and the porcelain became duranium as she awakened. Let's go, she said, getting up from the bed without hesitating. She went from dead asleep to wide awake in less than a second, an ability that Fabian Stevens envied, to say the least. The previous night, Corsi had moved toward the bed with a lithe elegance and softness that Stevens would not have previously credited her with. Now, though, soft was the last word he'd used to describe how she moved away from it. Efficient, though, that he'd use. Though he'd been awake for almost half an hour, it took Stevens several seconds to drag himself out of bed, grab the various parts of his uniform — he hadn't really been paying attention to where he'd dropped them last night — and put them on. By the time Corsi was in uniform and had tied her hair neatly back, Stevens was still struggling with his pants. Mr. Stevens, she said formally, I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak of this to anyone, and I hope you won't think that it was the beginning of anything. Stevens let out a bark of laughter. To be honest, I hadn't thought that far ahead. I appreciate what you did, she said, still talking like an officer, which Stevens supposed was inevitable. And I am grateful, but I'm not in the habit. Holding up a hand, Stevens said, Say no more, Commander. This stays between us. Good. I'm going ahead to the meeting. I'll see you there. She turned on her heel and left. Stevens watched for several seconds before putting on his shirt. When he arrived at the observation lounge, most of the usual suspects were seated. Captain Gold was at the head, of course, with Duffy at his left. Duff was holding a mostly full cup of quinine water, so he'd already had his morning coffee. Solomon, Corsi, and Dr. Lenz sat next to him. Corsi seemed to be pointedly not making eye contact with Stevens as he entered. Patty Blue was in her special chair opposite the captain. Abramowitz was, Stevens noticed, sitting next to Gold on his right, which was put her as far from Patty as possible. Guess the dread music battles haven't concluded yet, he thought with a smile. Of course, Abramowitz could only sit there because Gomez, the one missing S.C.E. member, was still off ship. Falwell was seated next to Abramowitz, which left 2 chairs free, one opposite Lenz, one opposite Corsi. Deciding that discretion was the best he could do, Stevens sat opposite Lenz. Corsi didn't seem to notice. "Now that Stevens has deigned to join us," Gold said dryly, "here's the story. We're not going to Deep Space Nine to help them with repairs, though we are going to their aid. We've been diverted to rendezvous with one of their runabouts and then proceed to an abandoned Cardassian station in the Trevis system known as Empok Nor." Stevens muttered, "Quoth the Empok, never nor." "Excuse me?" Gold said, one of his bushy eyebrows raised. Shifting in his seat, Stevens said, "Sorry, sir, that's something one of the engineers at DS9 came up with after the first time we... Well, see, when I was assigned to DS9, our Chief of Operations, Miles O'Brien, went over there to get some spare parts. Unfortunately, half the team didn't make it back. There was some kind of Cardassian booby trap left behind. We never really wanted to go back after that, and one of the engineers was a fan of old poetry, so she made that joke. It kind of stuck." "Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven," Abramowitz said helpfully. "The line is really, quoth the raven, nevermore." Nodding, Gold said, "Well, these ravens are flying back. DS9 had to eject their fusion core, and their new chief of operations, a lieutenant named Nog, is meeting us in the Trevis system in order to obtain a replacement." Stevens looked up in surprise at that. "Nog's chief now?" "You know him?" Gold asked. "Yeah, he was a cadet when I was there. In fact, come to think of it, he was part of the team that went to Empok Nor." With a small smile, Duffy said, "Obviously, he was one of the ones who survived." "Good guess," Stevens said, also smiling. "He's a lieutenant now?" "That's what the mission profile says," Duffy said, punching up a display. It showed the familiar features of the nervous young Ferengi Stevens remembered, but now wearing a junior-grade lieutenant's uniform. "First Corsi and I wind up in bed together, then I find out that Nog's got a commission and is doing the chief's job. This is a very weird day." "The plan," Duffy continued, "is to detach the fusion core and bring it back to DS9. "The whole core?" Stevens asked. "Yep. Apparently they had to eject it during that little brouhaha with the Jem'Hadar." Stevens started scratching his chin. "Geez, the emergency power wouldn't last 5 minutes. We'd have to link together a bunch of emergency generators, maybe 6 or 7 to get him going." "Way ahead of you, Stevens," Gold said with that avuncular smile of his that meant he was being indulgent of these silly engineers and their endless ramblings. "They don't need our help with that. There's already a passel of S.C.E. folks on station. What they do need help with is getting Empok Nor's fusion core from Trevis to DS9. Falwell spoke up. "Are we sure there's anything there to take? I mean, if the station's just sitting there." Duffy shrugged. The lieutenant seemed to think there was. Sir?" Corsi said as she stared down at the pad. "I'm looking over the records of the station right now. From the looks of it, it's a security nightmare." "Oh, come on, Corsi," Duffy said with an incredulous look. "The station's in the middle of nowhere. The Cardassians didn't just abandon the station, they abandoned that whole star system, and it's still unclaimed. It's got to be the least strategically valuable piece of real estate in the sector." "Maybe, but besides the mission Stevens mentioned, there have been a bunch of incidents on the station. It's been used as a neutral territory meeting on more than one occasion. A group of Bajoran cultists used it as their base of operations last year. Last reports do have it being abandoned, though." "So what's the problem?" Duffy asked. Corsi finally looked up from her pad and fixed Duffy with a withering look. Stevens found he couldn't help but contrast it with the expression on her face not 15 minutes earlier when she was asleep. "The problem is that just anybody can walk in. The station has no defenses worth mentioning, but plenty of equipment that might attract salvagers. I can easily see Ferengi, Uridian, Orion, or Cardassian pirates, not to mention someone like the Andrasi, gutting the place. We need to be on alert for anything. Whatever or whoever you send over there, I want a security detail of at least 5. Duffy nodded. "Fine." He looked around the table. "This is a straight-up nuts-and-bolts operation. So it'll be me, Stevens, Blue, and Solomon. Fabe, you'll be especially useful since your time on DS9 means you actually know these systems." "Well, mostly," Stevens said. "I mean, I spent most of my time on the Defiant, and the station had been pretty thoroughly modified by the time I got there. Empok Nor is still pure Cardassian. I'm not saying I can't do anything, but I don't want anyone to get raised expectations or anything." Smiling, Duffy said, "Don't worry about it, Fabe. We always have low expectations for you." A chuckle passed around the table. "Gee, thanks," Stevens said sardonically, and he considered throwing something at the second officer. "Anyhow," Duffy said, turning back to Corsi, "counting this Nog guy, that's 5. 1 security guard for each of us." "We may want to double the security detail." Corsi's lips were pursed. Duffy frowned. "We've already got a 10-person away team commander. I think making it 15 is excessive." "I don't. Those cultists I mentioned, I just noticed who led them. She held up her pad, the display of which now showed a familiar Cardassian face. Ducat. You remember, the guy who brought the Dominion to this quadrant in the first place? And before that, the station crawled with Jem'Hadar, Vorta, Ferengi, not to mention that mission Fade mentioned with the Cardassian booby trap. Stevens looked up sharply. She called me Fade. While on duty. In a meeting, for crying out loud. What the hell? If Corsi or anyone else noticed the slip, they didn't show it. A 10-person team is enough, Duffy said. Good, Gold said, while thus cutting off Corsi's protest. We're sent to rendezvous with the Rio Grande at 0830. Make sure the team's ready, Commander. Duffy got up. Yes, sir. A buzz started to sound in the room as people got up from their chairs. Corsi, Stevens noticed, shot a venomous look at Duffy before turning and leaving the observation lounge. Patty also didn't get up from her chair until after Abramowitz had left the room. Stevens went to the replicator and got himself a cup of coffee. By the time it materialized, only he and Bart Falwell were left in the lounge. So, Bart said, when did this thing between you and Corsi develop? Stevens sputtered his coffee. Chuckling, Bart said, computer napkin. One materialized in the replicator, and Stevens snatched it and wiped the stains off his uniform jacket. How the hell did you... Deductive reasoning, Bart said with a grin. You two were the last ones in. You spent the entire meeting pointedly not looking at each other, and he didn't come back to our cabin last night. Trying to sound dismissive, Stevens said, that's it? Well, plus she called you Fade during the meeting. That pretty much clinched it for me. Stevens sighed. I suppose if anyone is going to catch that, it'd be the linguist. Look, Bart, this can't get out. Wait, easy, Bart said, holding up a hand. The only reason I figured it out is because I know you didn't come home last night. If you two want to have an affair and keep it secret... Hell, it isn't even an affair. Just a one-nighter, really, and I still haven't got the first clue as to what brought it on. What happened? Stevens told Bart about seeing her uncharacteristic appearance in the mess hall and her equally uncharacteristic invitation to join him. We talked for hours. She moved around a lot when she was a kid. Her family lived on like 12 different planets. That got me going about planet hopping around the Rigel colonies with my parents' shuttle service. Then it was Starfleet stories. He took a sip of his coffee, managing to actually swallow it this time, and then continued. Next thing I know, she's inviting me back to her cabin. Lenz was on duty, so we had the place to ourselves. Now there's a pairing, Bart said. What on earth do you think our security chief and chief medical officer talk about in their downtime? Chuckling, Stevens said, Bart, until last night I wouldn't have believed that Domenica ever was off duty. Now you're doing it. Doing what? You called her Domenica. I don't think anyone on this ship has ever referred to her as anything other than Corsi, Commander, or Core Breach, at least in the 4 months I've been here. Stevens thought back. She asked me to. I was actually calling her Commander for the first hour, and then she said to call her Domenica. He laughed. Come to think of it, she also said if I called her Dom, she'd kill me. Well, they teach you that stuff at the academy. Another sip of coffee. She was amazingly, well, gentle and warm. Bart, I did not spend the night with a woman who deserves to be nicknamed Core Breach. And you don't know what prompted it? No clue, Stevens shook his head. Well, do yourself a favor. Try not to think about it until after the mission. Neither of you needs the distraction. Grinning, Stevens said, What, your ship's counselor now? No, but you don't need a linguist for this mission, so I thought I'd moonlight, Bart said, returning the grin. Seriously, before I met Anthony, I had my share of one-nighters. They have this tendency to linger in the brain, more so if you have to interact with the person. He put an encouraging hand on Stevens' shoulder. Just be careful, okay? Stevens took a sip of coffee, then nodded. I will. Thanks, Bart. Hey, that's what roommates are for. To be continued next week. This, like I said, this was a fun little crossover to do. We'll actually see Nog in the next installment. Chapter 4 starts with him on the Rio Grande. And I had a lot of fun with this. Anyway, by the way, if you're wondering about Gomez, you will not see Gomez in this story. The reason why you won't see Gomez in this story will be made clear in the two-part story that I'll be reading for March and April, which takes place at the same time. She's her mission to construct a subspace accelerator will be the plot of Invincible, which is the next story in the S.C.E. series, which is actually a collaboration between myself and David Mack. That'll be what I read again for March and April. So you'll find out all about that. Anyway, thank you very much for tuning in. I'll see you next week when I go to part 2. You can find me online at DeCandido.net. Read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com, and if you could please support me on Patreon, that would be great. Patreon.com/crad. Thank you very much, and please stay safe.